an elephant, an artistic elephant to be rediscovered, as I show here. Namely, and maybe we have to talk a little bit about also the reasons why somebody like Maerten de Vos is not as famous or not as known as he should be. First of all, in the 16th century in Antwerp, he was a bit dwarfed, or he was a bit pushed away by two major figures, namely Peter Bruegel the Elder and also Frans Floris. Now, maybe if I talk about Frans Floris, at some point, Frans Floris, in the middle of the 16th century, he was the most famous painter, perhaps in Antwerp, next to Bruegel, and he got a lot of commissions. But during the tormented 16th century in Antwerp, many of his works, or several of his works, were destroyed. And it got him quite frustrated also. Besides, he had a large studio, but he was also quite, let's say, slow in working. That's at least what is being told in some of the sources. And in his shadow, Maerten de Vos came into being, became this artist. Now, here are some dates. It's a bit, maybe a little bit rigid here, but at least it gives you a bit of an approach on dates. So he's born in 1532. And his father, who came from Leiden, he was a painter too. And he also, the father of Maerten de Vos, was also head of the St. Luke's Guild. So that's important a little bit to know in respect what is happening later on. Then in the early 50s, he travels to Italy. According to Vamander and Ridolfi, he visited Rome, but also Venice. And that's more important because Ridolfo is saying that he painted backgrounds in the studio of Tintoretto. Now, that has met with some skepsis, also amongst scholars of Venetian art. And many of them have been trying to find out if there are Tintoretto paintings with, possible Maerten de Vos backgrounds. And that's really difficult to say. We can't prove that. And also in Venice, it would be needed to search the archives if a pittore fiammingo called Martino is present anyway. Now, if you look at his paintings, and we will see some examples later on, you will see that there is definitely undeniable some impact of Tintoretto, but equally of other Venetian painters. I mean, equally, you could say Veronese, for instance. The color schemes of Veronese are also in Maerten de Vos. Now, he has an older brother called Peter, of whom we don't know anything, except for that he also had a pupil, and that he was slightly older, but probably less gifted. We don't have any signed paintings by him, but whatever. Now, Maerten, he travels to Italy, according to Ridolfi and Vamander, with Bruegel, but we don't know for sure. That's also a sort of assumption that he would have traveled with Peter Bruegel. And when he's coming back, he registers as a master in the St. Luke's Guild, and he marries Johanna Le Bouc, and she's from a northern French family from Valenciennes. And through that family, he gets also quite some commissions for Valenciennes churches. Still at Valenciennes, there's a big altarpiece with the Adoration of the Magi on canvas, which is magnificent, and it's probably thanks to his wife's relationships. Then in 1562, 1563, he paints his first cycle, and do I have? Yeah, I have some examples here. That's a cycle of 8 paintings that turns up in the 17th, 18th century in the Église Saint-Patrice at Rouen. And we're not sure that it was really made for that church. It's probably made for one of the rich merchants in Antwerp that were around. Merchants in the, let's say, in the circle of Gillis Hoofdman. Gillis Hoofdman was a very wealthy an entrepreneur. He was instrumental also in the battle of the Dutch against the Spanish. He was a Calvinist, and he was really the center of a small group of people, intellectuals, so Lutheran Calvinist intellectuals that supported Maerten de Vos. So we also think that Maerten de Vos, together with his wife, who came from a Huguenot, French Huguenot family, he must have been more, let's say, Protestant than Catholic in faith. You see here this example of the story of Rebecca at Rouen, and it probably made part of a cycle of paintings intended for a home rather than a church. Going back still here. At the same time here, he engages also a first student, or shall I say pupil, I said here. Is it pupil, is it student, is it a disciple? We're not sure about it, but we are sure that a little bit later, he gets also the commission from the Duke of Braunschweig-Lüneburg for the chapel at Cell Castle. So it might be that a student like that or a pupil like that is already collaborating in his studio to make paintings. And also his son Daniel is born. And Daniel is known to have been somebody who painted lids of clavicymbals and virginals. Antwerp was a musical center producing instruments, and some of these lids on these instruments were painted with allegorical scenes by Daniel. Also interesting is this last. So it was Johannes Radermacher, an intellectual who was working together with Gillis Hoofdman in the London branch of the Hoofdman enterprise, who promoted Maerten de Vos for the commission of the dining room paintings of Gillis Hoofdman. That's a second cycle, and I will show you. That's this, and this is the story of Paul. So you see here 2 paintings out of a cycle of 5 paintings that must have existed. Only 3 of them are preserved in Brussels, in the Louvre, and in a private collection. And I show 2 of them here. It's a bit the same principle as those paintings at Rouen. So made for a dining room in a very horizontal format. So you must have, and in fact, Bruegel did the same. In fact, that's a sort of simple principle for the villas at the outskirts of Antwerp, decorating those villas for these wealthy burghers. Here you can see Gillis Hoofdman and his wife in the Rijksmuseum, and his son-in-law, Antonius Anselmo, in the painting at the museum in Brussels. So this is really this wealthy group of burghers, Protestant burghers, who act as patrons for Maerten de Vos. Also, Panhuis, who is also, as a family, the family Panhuis, they're connected with Hoofdman and with Anselmo. And this is a very big painting in Utrecht in the Catharijnen convent, showing this sort of gathered around Moses with his stone tables. And this is a group of Protestant intellectuals that are in fact the patrons of Maerten de Vos. And And you can also spot the artist himself in here. And that guy is Georg Hoefnagel, the famous miniaturist. He too makes part of this group. So these are, let's say, entrepreneurs, travelers. Hoefnagel traveled widely throughout Europe, and they were interconnected. And the Hoofdman enterprise sent ships from the Baltic region, from here, to North Africa. And that too is important for, if we take into account some paintings I will show later. Such as these, for instance. These paintings ended up in Spain. This painting was painted for a monastery in Seville, and it's still in Seville in the museum. Whereas this Rape of Europa ended up in the museum in Bilbao, has definitely also a Spanish provenance. And in it, you can easily recognize the Venetian impact. You spot somehow also a little bit El Greco in it, but you can also spot Titian in it, whereas we're not so sure how or when and where Maerten de Vos would have spotted Titian's famed Rape of Europa that was painted for Philip II, that was already gone to Madrid while Maerten de Vos was in Venice. So we are not so sure about how and when he would have seen the Titian prototype. Now, in 1571, he's then appointed as the Dean of the St. Luke's Guild. And then there's this story of, in this tormented age of Mechelen besieged by Spanish soldiers. So the painters of Mechelen fled to Antwerp to get asylum there. And it was Maerten de Vos who secured their position. So it shows also that he was quite engaged as a person. And that's also something that is seen here in this. He also is the guy who is going to block the fact that the guild wanted to sell off the altarpiece of Quinten Massès, a very famed altarpiece, the first big important painting in Antwerp, and it was Maerten de Vos who asked the city council to buy the painting for the city of Antwerp as a sort of protective measure, which is quite some engaging thing to do, I think.
400 years before his time.
Yeah, sure. He also engages in the 70s Wenzel Kuberger. That's the only one of the 11 collaborators he engages that are really well known. Wenzel Kuberger, as you probably know, is a painter, but is also a court architect of the archducal pair. So he will become really an important figure in the early 17th century. But so he studied with Maerten de Vos. The other pupils or disciples, we don't know much about them. They must be somewhere in the production of the master, but we don't know. And then he buys also a house in 1579, Den Tobias in the Schuttershofstraat. Now, in the late 60s, begin 70s, he is going to be engaged by the Duke of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, William II, to decorate the Schlosskapelle. And in fact, if you look at this chapel, it's amazing. It's a sort of Protestant Sixtine chapel with a lot of subjects. That you have the big altarpiece, but all these smaller panels are done by Maerten de Vos and his studio. So that's already let's say an example of where his studio collaborators are working for. They're decorating the church, equally this big redemption yeah. Also, a second duke, the Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, who has a menagerie at Schwerin, so that's a sort of zoo. I'm not pretending that he had a unicorn at his zoo, but you never know, maybe a horse with a sort of thing glued on his forehead also, I don't know. But at least for the castle, he had a large series of these animals and fantastic animals made. There are still more, and some of them are probably also vanished or destroyed. But some of, and they're not always in good condition, but at some point we hope, if we make an exhibition at any point, that some of them might be on show. So that is, of course, absolutely fantastic. And I think paintings like that must somehow be autographed, I think. Those are important court commissions. He's an artist that is not still recognized by everybody, but he has to produce things that are worth looking at. So that's... And then he also produces, and that is the St. Thomas triptych for the furriers in Antwerp. That's his first major altarpiece produced for a guild in the Antwerp Cathedral. Those are the beautiful outer wings. And I have to say, when we were closed as a museum, we showed several of the altarpieces of the 16th century in Antwerp Cathedral. And some of these altarpieces remained there as a permanent loan. And this is one of them. So this, you can see this painting in Antwerp Cathedral, also these back panels. And in fact, they are really very beautifully painted. And somehow, normally, in European painting tradition, the backs of shutters, when the shutters are closed, they usually are done by the studio. They are always considered of less importance. But if you look at this quality, it's very high. And also here, I think the fact that it was made for Antwerp Cathedral and that it was an important first commission, that might have been the reason why maybe the painter himself produced this. The quality is simply very high. And this is the interior. So the St. Thomas and so the baptism of Christ, and here the beheading of St. John the Baptist. You can see that Maerten de Vos is amongst those who have brought the Venetian color schemes to the north, to Antwerp. That his figures are quite, let's say, solid and sometimes a bit wooden. You have to say that too. But at the same time, the volumes are very monumental and very, very characteristic. Important paintings, I think, for Antwerp. And in those years also, so between 77 and 85, Antwerp becomes a Calvinistic republic. So of course, you have the troubles with the iconoclasm in the previous years, and during that iconoclasm, lots of paintings and sculptures have been destroyed in Antwerp. And then you have a second, let's say, a second silent iconoclastic period during these Calvinistic times, when religious paintings are taken from the monasteries and the churches and taken to burghers' homes or to the guilds halls and so on. So taken out of sight. Now, this doesn't prevent Maerten de Vos from producing paintings also for Spain. So he keeps on producing some paintings, whereas you would think, those are problematic times to work for an international clientele in Spain also. But he goes further. And that's interesting because a Protestant painter producing for Catholic Spain, and we'll see also that it goes further. So Antwerp then finally is conquered by Alessandro Farnese, the fall of Antwerp. And then Antwerp is back under Spanish rule. And you see that it's a little bit problematic for Maerten de Vos at one side from the religious point of view, because he's a Protestant. And Farnese says all Protestants should leave the city, or if you want to stay, you convert into Catholicism. And we think that Maerten de Vos probably took that sort of attitude and said, well, Anvers vaut bien une messe, and he stayed in Antwerp. Being a sort of hidden Protestant, he produced a lot of altarpieces for the churches, because these churches, of course, were emptied. And strangely enough, there was this opportunity of working, of producing altarpieces, new altarpieces for Antwerp churches. Here you still have an example of a work during his Calvinistic times. You can see this famous painting ended up in Mexico. It was intended for the high altar of Mexico Cathedral. It's now in another city, near Mexico, in Cuautitlan. But this is a painting that has been, let's say, reproduced in prints, in a Maerten de Vos print, and that was disseminated throughout Europe, but also throughout the New World, where it was, let's say, copied. There are even ivory figures in the Philippines made with this as prototype. So it's among the first painters that is represented worldwide, also on the new continent. And it's a first-class painting. You can see this is absolutely stunning in quality. So here you see them further Alexander Fergie. Then, in the later period of his life, because he dies in 1603, in the later period, he has a wealth of commands. So there's a gigantic amount of work, altarpieces to be done for Antwerp churches. So in the beginning of his career, he worked for a Protestant elite. And in the second half of his career, he simply worked for the to re-Catholicize the Antwerp churches. And that is a very, a shift in mind. He's also doing decorations for Ernst of Austria, for the joyous entry of him. His son Daniel becomes master in the St. Luke's Guild. And then, he finally paints that celebrated altarpiece for the St. Luke's Guild, which I'll show you in a minute. In this period, the museum in Antwerp preserves a lot of altarpieces, some altarpieces from this second period. So we don't have a lot of works in the collection of the earlier Maerten de Vos, but those are at Celle and at Rouen and so on. But we can present the later Maerten de Vos at his best. And this is another very famous commission, the triptych of the Old Crossbow Guild. And this, sadly, we don't see in the museum because we see the triptych opened in the open state. We seldom or never see it closed, whereas it is absolutely fantastic. This is a painting that has not been cleaned yet. It's high on our priority list, but since we are first restoring Rubens's, and you can't do you can't do all these big paintings at once. This is a to-do still on our list. But you can see this very beautiful St. George and the dragon and the Princess of Silena, and this dragon who, you know, Steven Spielberg couldn't think about this. This is so incredible. And then when the triptych is open, you see this. So this is the redemption of Christ, of course, with at the left the baptism of the King of Silena, on the right, the King of Silena building a church. So it is really a monumental piece meant for Antwerp Cathedral. And if you look at it from nearby, and I don't have, let's say, sufficient material to show it, you can see that it has underdrawing, very loose underdrawing in chalk. If you want to see it on infrared images, well, you need enormous infrared images to show it, because if you show it on this scale, you can't see it, you know? So I didn't bother, but it is there. It's very loosely underdrawn. So that too makes me believe that he, as a master, he at least has drawn the composition on the panel. And then to some extent, I think also that he was largely, you know, responsible for the execution too. For this altarpiece, we also have drawings, preparatory drawings that are very typical of his style. You see this with these sort of accents and dots and points. It's very typical of Maerten de Vos. The final painting follows it quite precisely, except for the fact that these figures, this is simply, in fact, the resurrection of Christ, and then the soldiers that fall, that are blown away by it. But apparently the guilds or the church wardens, they didn't want that, because if you look at what happened, it's far more static than what he proposed. He proposed something that was far more dynamic, and he ended up with an altarpiece that was much more static. So only to tell that we don't have, not always can blame the artist for the paintings he makes. Also, yeah, well, you can see here so that is very. He follows. Here he also changes a bit, you know, the sort of the priest, you know, the helper here. He mirrors it, but for the same, it's more or less the same. Then, what we found out a few years ago is also the existence of some head studies that can be connected with this painting. And this head study of a man looking to the right is somehow connected with these heads. You know, it's never quite exactly the same, but it's the same prototype of a man. And and it also proves that besides Frans Floris, who's famous for having produced a number of such head studies, and Van Manders writes about it, that Frans Floris has so many students, 120 students, he says, and the production of such Troniën. Well, Maerten de Vos probably did the same, but it's our job to try to recognize them. They're on the market, sometimes these head studies are popping up, but then they're anonymous. And so here we can see, that's how Maerten de Vos produces them. And I found out that the same model, but then being looked at from the front, is also used in this figure. So they look far more realistic, and this is a vagabond. If you look at him, meet him in the street, he's a kind of vagabond, and he's turned into a king, which is of course quite quite nice to see how he makes use of those models in a better way. And it also gives you an idea about one model being used and seen from different angles, which is something that Rubens also will do later on. So it's a common practice to do that. Then let me tell you something about our Temptation of Saint Anthony, which is a painting we did restore. And in our own studio, and you can see Jill and Ellen, and I forgot who that is. Probably. Is that Eva still? Okay. That is, and they're retouching the Temptation in. It's Claire. Okay. Well, need to be precise, and so yeah, it was turned around because in that way, three conservators can work on the painting at the same moment. Otherwise, it will be more difficult. And the painting is in fairly good condition. You can see that only, around the joints you have some problems, but at the same time, yeah, it's in great shape. This painting is peculiar in this, and it's considered as a very retardataire, how do you call it? A very slightly backward painting in the sense that, similar presentations of Saint Anthony, we know them, of course, from Mathis Gotthard Nittard, and from here also Cranach. We think that Maerten de Vos, Martin II, who was the Maerten de Vos specialist, he considered the Cranach print as a basis from which Maerten de Vos took his composition. And what is more important is that the painting technique, I have to finish, okay, is that the painting technique is referring to Bruegel, but is also already giving a sort of idea for Rubens. So what he does is combining the old Flemish thin technique with the Venetian colors, and applying highlights in a thicker way. And I'll show you some details. Now I have to go a little bit further. This is a typical detail that could be, in fact, if you look at it from nearby, that could be by Rubens. I mean, it's so similar. Yeah, then a painting which is also important for here, because the museum here in Tallinn has also a version of this banquet, the marriage at Cana, for which there is also a design, a drone design. We have still also a nativity for the Capuchins of Mechelen that is not restored, but is also quite good in quality. This crucifixion, workshop crucifixion, which is definitely workshop, because if you look at the details, they're much more, let's say, rudimentary. It's also a little bit more stiff, but anyway, not bad at all. But you see these dark varnishes, they don't help, to assess the painting fully. Yeah? And then I have to end up, because otherwise I'm taking too much time. So I will end here. So thank you for your attention.